She begged them to stop, but the men only laughed. They shoved her to the ground, kicked her newborn from her arms, and walked away, believing no one cared. But God had already placed a protector nearby, an off-duty Navy SEAL who heard the cry. In a flash of rage and faith, he ran through the crowd, his K9 beside him, to face the darkness no one else dared. Blood on the pavement, a child, barely breathing, and one soldier fighting not for orders, but for mercy. That day, violence met something greater, divine purpose. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. The sun hung low above Silver Creek, its faint warmth filtering through the thin veil of coastal mist. The small town rested between the forest and the bay, quiet, worn, and haunted by the kind of silence that hides more than it reveals. Near the gas station at the edge of town stood Silver Mart, a modest convenience store that smelled faintly of coffee, detergent, and tired lives. Grace Miller's morning had started long before dawn. Sleep had become a stranger ever since her husband's death 3 months earlier, a construction accident that left her with nothing but debt, a newborn child, and a house too heavy with memories. She worked both day and night shifts now, moving like a ghost between aisles of canned soup and broken fluorescent lights. Her baby, Ryan, barely 3 months old, slept in a cardboard box behind the counter, wrapped in an old blanket from the church donation drive. It wasn't ideal, but it was all she had. Every time she rang up a customer, her mind replayed her husband's last day, the phone call from the hospital, the voice that said, "Instant impact, nothing could be done." She had tried to cry then, but the tears had stopped coming after the funeral. Grief had hardened into something quieter, heavier. At 1:47 p.m., the bell over the door chimed. Grace looked up, expecting another local, maybe a farmer's wife or a trucker needing gas. Instead, 3 men walked in. They didn't belong to Silver Creek. You could tell by the way they looked around as if everything was for sale. Their boots were dusty, their jackets cheap, but their smiles were confident, the kind worn by men who knew the rules didn't apply to them. The one in front, a thin man with a scar near his lip, placed a folder on the counter. "Ms. Miller," he said, his voice slick as oil. "Mr. Kane's been patient, but patience doesn't pay interest." Grace froze. The name hit like a punch. Victor Kane, the loan shark who had funded her husband's business before the accident and who had demanded repayment 2 weeks after the funeral. She had tried to explain, tried to promise, even begged for more time, but the men Kane sent didn't deal in promises. "I'm still paying," Grace said quietly. "Every week. I just need—" The man laughed and tapped the paper. "You're behind, way behind. Mr. Kane's not interested in excuses anymore. Sign the deed, and your problem disappears." Her hands trembled as she stepped back. "That's my home. It's all I have left." The second man, heavier and impatient, kicked the counter. "You'll sign, or we'll take it anyway." His eyes shifted toward the box behind her. "Cute kid. He's quiet. You trained him well?" Grace moved instinctively, stepping between him and the box. "Don't you touch him." But cruelty doesn't always come with warning. The man grinned, then, in one careless motion, shoved the box with his boot. The baby gave a weak cry and hit the side of the counter with a soft, terrible sound that froze Grace's blood. "Stop!" she screamed. She dropped to her knees, clutching Ryan to her chest. The world became a blur of noise and terror, the smell of sweat and beer, the sound of laughter, then from outside, the low growl of an engine. A shadow passed the window. Ethan Walker had seen many kinds of violence. After 10 years in the Navy SEALs, he had learned to recognize the shape of danger, even in a quiet town. He had come to Silver Creek for Silence, renting a small cabin near the woods, but Silence had never been kind to men like him. It carried the ghosts of places he could never name and faces he could never forget. He parked his Jeep near the curb and heard the scream. It wasn't just fear. It was the sound of a mother breaking. He opened the door, and the sound of his boots hitting asphalt was enough to turn the heads inside. The doorbell rang. 3 pairs of eyes met his. For a heartbeat, the store went still. Ethan's gaze flicked from the men to the woman crouched on the floor, and then to the limp baby in her arms. He said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy as a drawn bowstring. "Walk away, soldier," the scarred man said. "Not your fight." Ethan's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Everything's my fight when a child's hurt." The man reached into his jacket. That was all it took. Ethan moved faster than thought, a blur of training and instinct. 1 second the man was standing, the next his wrist was twisted, the weapon sliding across the floor. The second thug lunged but met Ethan's elbow to the throat. The third turned just in time to see a dark shape, Milo, leap through the open door. The dog hit him square in the chest, knocking him backward. There was no barking, no chaos, just precision. Ethan didn't need to say a word. The years of missions, of violence wrapped in discipline, played out again in that small-town store. When the noise settled, 2 men groaned on the floor, the third unconscious. Grace was still on her knees, trembling, rocking her baby. Ethan knelt beside her. "He's breathing," he said softly after checking the infant's pulse. "But he needs a hospital, now." Grace could barely speak. "Who are you?" "Someone who got tired of watching good people lose." He lifted the baby carefully, wrapping him in the blanket. "Let's go." Milo followed as they left, silent and alert. The road shimmered in the afternoon heat as Ethan drove through town. Grace sat beside him, clutching the edge of the seat, whispering prayers to a God she hadn't spoken to in years. At Silver Creek General, Ethan didn't wait for formalities. He carried the baby straight to the emergency desk. "Infant head trauma," he said firmly. "Now!" Doctors rushed in, the automatic doors closing behind them. Grace sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. The adrenaline drained from her body, replaced by shaking and guilt. "It's my fault," she whispered. "I shouldn't have brought him. I shouldn't have." Ethan sat down beside her, his voice low but steady. "You did what you had to. People like Cain, they prey on that guilt. Don't let him have that too." She looked at him for the first time, seeing not the uniform or the strength, but the weight in his eyes, the kind of weight that comes from losing too much and surviving anyway. Through the window of the emergency room, the afternoon light fell on the small, fragile body of the child being treated. Ethan stared at it for a long time, his jaw tight. Beside him, Milo sat motionless, watching every nurse that passed, as if guarding the doorway itself. He thought of all the missions where he'd arrived too late. This time, he told himself, would be different. Outside, the sun dipped toward the tree line, painting Silver Creek in gold. Inside, a man who had seen too much war realized that not all battles are fought with guns. Some are fought in silence, against the cruelty that hides behind a smile. And Ethan Walker knew he had just stepped into another war. The faint hum of hospital machines filled the room, their steady rhythm the only sound between two strangers who had shared a moment of violence and fear. Outside the window, the gray Oregon sky pressed low, heavy with the smell of salt and pine. The town of Silver Creek might have been quiet again, but inside this building, the war had simply changed shape. Grace Miller sat on the edge of her hospital bed, her hands trembling in her lap. Her knuckles were raw from gripping the handle of the stretcher earlier, and her eyes were hollow with exhaustion. The nurses had cleaned the blood from her child's hair, wrapped his small head in a bandage, and told her that he was stable. But the word meant nothing to her. Stability was temporary. Safety was a story she no longer believed in. Ethan Walker stood near the door, arms crossed, his posture that of a man who never really left the battlefield. His dog, Milo, rested on the floor at his feet, head raised, eyes unblinking, the kind of stillness that came from years of waiting for commands that might never come. He had said little since bringing her here. It wasn't because he didn't care, it was because he didn't trust himself to speak. War had taken that from him, the ability to say the right thing when it mattered. Grace finally broke the silence. "You didn't have to stay." Her voice was hoarse, fragile. "You don't even know us." Ethan looked at her. "I didn't stay because I know you. I stayed because I've seen what happens when no one does." She stared down at her fingers. "They'll come back." He didn't argue. "I know." For a while neither of them spoke. The faint beeping from the next room, her son's heartbeat, filled the silence. Grace swallowed hard. "You heard what they said about the debt?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Victor Kane." The name carried a weight he didn't like. In his years of service, he'd heard names like that in war zones, men who didn't need guns to destroy lives. Grace gave a weak laugh that wasn't really laughter. "My husband borrowed from him last year. Construction work slowed down, bills piled up. Kane sent his men to help." She looked away, her gaze drifting toward the floor tiles. "When the accident happened, they said I inherited the debt. He came to the funeral." Ethan's jaw tightened. "To the funeral?" "He said I had a week to start payments." Her lips trembled. "I thought he was bluffing. I sold everything I could, the car, the furniture. Then I started giving plasma. Twice a week, sometimes 3 times. When they didn't check the records, I just needed to keep the house." Milo stirred, as if sensing the ache in her voice. Ethan sat down across from her, elbows on his knees. "You've been through worse than most soldiers I know." She shook her head. "I'm not strong. I'm just broke." He almost smiled, not at her words, but at the bitter honesty in them. There was no self-pity in her tone, just the kind of resignation that came from someone who had learned to survive rather than hope. The door opened slightly, and a nurse stepped in. "Mr. Walker, the baby's stable, but we'll need to keep him under observation for 48 hours. Grace exhaled sharply, relief breaking through her fatigue. "Can I see him?" "Of course." Ethan waited until she left the room before leaning back in his chair. His mind wasn't quiet. It hadn't been for years. But now the noise took a different form. Silver Creek had seemed like the kind of town where ghosts stayed buried. He had come here after losing too many friends, too many brothers in arms, believing maybe isolation could be healing. But as he watched Grace through the glass wall of the neonatal room, he realized something cruel. Evil didn't care about coordinates. It existed anywhere someone was desperate enough to need mercy. Milo let out a low, restless sigh. Ethan reached down to scratch behind his ear. "Yeah," he murmured. "We're not done here, are we?" The next morning, Grace sat by her baby's crib. The color had returned to Ryan's cheeks, his breathing soft and even. She hummed under her breath a song she didn't remember learning, and for a fleeting moment she looked peaceful. Ethan brought her coffee from the cafeteria, setting it down without a word. She thanked him quietly. After a while she asked, "You used to be military?" He nodded. "Navy SEALs." Her eyes flickered with recognition. "That explains it. The way you moved. I've seen that look before, when my husband came back from his deployments." Ethan hesitated. "He served?" "Marines," she said softly. "Before the accident, he used to tell me stories about the desert. Said sometimes he'd rather face bullets than bills." She smiled faintly. Then her voice cracked. "He died on a job site, not in a war. That feels wrong somehow." He looked at her for a long time, then said quietly, "War doesn't care where it finds you." A doctor entered, interrupting them. "Mrs. Miller, your son's responding well. We'll need to monitor him another day, but he's strong." Grace nodded, visibly trembling with relief. Ethan stood and moved toward the window, watching the cars pass outside the hospital parking lot. A black SUV drove slowly by, too slow for comfort. The driver didn't look up, but Ethan's instinct screamed anyway. He memorized the plate before the car disappeared down the street. When Grace looked back at him, she saw it in his eyes, that shift from calm to alert. "What is it?" "Nothing yet," he said. "But we should be careful." That evening, while Grace slept beside her child, Ethan stepped out into the corridor. Milo followed, silent but alert. The hallway was dimly lit, the hum of the vending machine the only sound. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a name he hadn't used in months. Emma Hayes, the county sheriff, and one of the few people he trusted from a previous case. She answered on the second ring. "Walker, I heard rumors you were hiding out near the coast." "Not hiding," he said. "Resting until today." Her tone sharpened. "What happened?" "Victor Kane's men attacked a woman and her kid at Silver Mart. I stopped it. They'll be back." There was a pause. "You just can't stay out of trouble, can you?" "Trouble finds people who can't fight back," Ethan replied. "Send me what you have," she said finally. "I'll run the plates." When he hung up, he stood in silence, staring out the window into the night. The lights of Silver Creek glowed dimly against the dark horizon, reflections shivering on the wet asphalt. Milo leaned against his leg, waiting. Ethan's voice was low, steady. "We'll give them one night," he murmured. "If they come again, they won't walk away." The dog didn't bark. He didn't have to. The understanding between them was old, forged in places far worse than this small town. In the room behind them, a mother slept beside her child, unaware that the man who had saved her life had already stepped back into a war he thought he'd left behind. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of morning that didn't invite new beginnings. The rain hadn't fallen yet, but the sky carried its promise, hanging low over Silver Creek like a secret. Ethan Walker parked his Jeep in front of the sheriff's office, a squat red brick building that leaned slightly to one side, as if exhausted from holding up the law in a town that kept breaking it. He stepped out, adjusting his sleeve to hide the bandage near his wrist, a small reminder of the fight 2 days before. Milo followed, paws clicking against the wet pavement, tail low but alert. The dog didn't relax in towns. He never had. Maybe it was the smell of gasoline and cheap perfume that reminded him of the places where men lied more than they spoke. Inside, Sheriff Emma Hayes looked up from a cluttered desk that hadn't seen daylight in years. She was in her late 40s, hair tied back tight, eyes sharp enough to make most men rethink their excuses. She didn't rise to greet him. She just smirked slightly. "I ran the plates," she said, sliding a paper toward him. "Belongs to a shell company out of Portland. Guess who owns it?" Ethan didn't need to ask. "Victor Kane?" Emma nodded. "Your instincts haven't dulled." She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Kane's been buying up land along the coast for months. On paper, he's a developer. Off paper." She sighed. "He's got half the council in his pocket. Nobody wants to cross him." Ethan studied the map on the wall. Several red pins marked the Silver Bay area, the coastal strip west of town. "What's he doing out there?" "Something big," Emma said. "Construction permits, private docks, shipping containers coming in at night. My guess? Not seafood." He nodded slowly, thinking of Grace's words, how Kane wanted her land. "She owns a property out by the ridge." Emma's eyes flicked up. "Then she's in more danger than she knows." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air in the room was thick with the quiet understanding of people who'd seen too much rot beneath polite smiles. Ethan finally said, "You'll need proof." Emma smiled faintly. "And I suppose you're volunteering?" He didn't answer, which was answer enough. By afternoon, the sky darkened into a bruised gray. Ethan drove toward the coast, the forest closing in around the narrow highway like tall green walls. Milo sat upright in the passenger seat, nose twitching at the scent of salt and pine. Silver Bay wasn't much, just a stretch of rocky shoreline and a few abandoned warehouses. The air smelled of rust and ocean wind. Ethan parked behind an old cannery, the Jeep blending into the shadows. He grabbed a pair of binoculars and crouched beside the broken fence. At first, nothing, just waves crashing against the docks. Then movement. 2 black trucks backed into a warehouse. Men in plain clothes unloading metal cases. No markings, no company. Lagos. Ethan zoomed in. The cases had serial codes etched into their corners, military style. He didn't need a manual to recognize the pattern. "Smuggling," he muttered. "Weapons or tech." Milo shifted beside him, ears twitching. A low rumble rose from the dog's chest. Not fear, but recognition. They'd both seen this kind of setup before, halfway around the world. The uniforms had changed, but the greed hadn't. Ethan pulled out his phone and snapped several photos, careful to keep low. Then he noticed something. A man standing apart from the others, watching the unloading with calm precision. He wore a dark coat, spoke quietly into a radio, and didn't lift a single crate. A supervisor, maybe, or something worse. Ethan focused the lens, and his stomach tightened. He knew that face. Milo Ferris, former contractor out of Nevada, last seen working black ops logistics for a private security firm. Ruthless, efficient, and always where the money flowed thickest. If Ferris was here, Kane's little empire wasn't just about money. It was about power. Ethan whispered to himself, so it's not just a loan shark. It's an operation. He sent the photos to Emma with a short text. "Found your proof, and a ghost I thought was gone." He lingered a few minutes more, just long enough to see the trucks drive off toward the inland road. Then he slipped back into the forest, taking the long route toward the highway. But instincts, the ones drilled into him from a decade of ambushes, told him he was being watched. Milo's growl confirmed it. A twig snapped somewhere behind. Ethan didn't turn. "Easy," he whispered. "Let them make the first mistake." The shot came, not close enough to kill, but close enough to warn. The bullet shattered bark inches from his head. Ethan hit the ground, rolling behind a fallen tree. Milo darted beside him, silent and focused. He waited 1, 2, 3 seconds, then returned fire with precision. The forest erupted with sound for only a moment before going still again. Then came the faint noise of a truck door slamming, tires grinding against gravel, and retreat. They were testing him, not trying to kill him yet, just reminding him whose town this was. When the forest quieted again, Ethan rose, brushing dirt from his sleeve. Milo looked up at him, eyes steady. "Yeah," Ethan muttered, "it's personal now." Back in town, Emma studied the photos on her computer, her jaw set. "This isn't local crime, Walker. This is interstate, maybe international. You're stirring a nest you can't swat." Ethan didn't flinch. "You asked for proof. Now you have it." "And what are you planning to do? March into Kane's office and tell him you disapprove?" He gave a dry half-smile. "Something like that." Emma sighed. "You're going to get yourself killed, or worse, get her killed." The mention of Grace's name stilled him. His mind flashed to her in the hospital room, holding her child with trembling hands, the exhaustion, the fear, the stubborn strength that reminded him of every civilian he'd ever tried to protect in a world that didn't protect them back. "I won't let that happen," he said quietly. Emma leaned forward. "Then you better move fast. Kane has eyes everywhere. If he knows you're digging into Silver Bay, he'll hit back, hard." Ethan nodded, turned toward the door. "Then I'll make sure he hits the wrong target." Outside, the rain finally began to fall, slow, cold drops that streaked across his windshield as he climbed into the Jeep. Milo shook the water from his coat and settled in beside him, eyes still fixed ahead. The road back to the cabin was long, twisting through pine and shadow, but Ethan didn't drive fast. His mind was already building the plan, not a mission, not a command, just a choice to fight for someone who couldn't fight back. He'd promised himself once that he'd never wear the SEAL's mindset again. But that promise had already been broken the moment he heard a baby cry in that store. As the Jeep disappeared into the fog, Silver Creek braced for a storm it didn't yet know was coming, and Ethan Walker, soldier without a war, had finally found one worth fighting. The rain had stopped by the time Ethan Walker reached the hospital again, but the air still carried the scent of wet earth and sea. The mountains behind Silver Creek looked darker now, heavy with fog that clung to their ridges like ghosts reluctant to leave. Inside, the corridors of the hospital were half empty, just nurses on tired feet and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Grace Miller stood by the window of her son's room, her reflection pale against the glass. Ryan slept quietly in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling beneath a thin white blanket. She looked peaceful for the first time since Ethan had met her, but there was something else behind that stillness, the kind of fear that never really left. Ethan knocked lightly on the doorframe. She turned, offering a small, weary smile. "You're still here." "Didn't have anywhere better to be," he replied. She glanced toward her son. "They said he can go home tomorrow." He hesitated before speaking. "You can't go home, Grace. Kane's men know where you live." Her face fell. "Then what am I supposed to do? I can't just disappear." "You don't have to disappear," he said. "Just stay somewhere they won't look." Grace studied him for a long time. "And where would that be?" Ethan looked out toward the forest beyond the town. "My cabin. It's quiet, safe, remote." Her instinct was to refuse. She didn't know him, not really, but she also didn't have a choice. She'd seen what those men could do, and she wasn't going to risk her son's life again. Finally, she nodded. "Just until it's safe." He gave a single, firm nod. "Just until then." The cabin stood deep in the pines, 2 miles off the old logging road. It had been built long before Ethan ever owned it, the kind of place meant for solitude, a single story of weathered wood, a stone fireplace, a porch that looked out toward the fog. He'd come here after his discharge, hoping the forest would drown out the echoes of war. It hadn't, not completely, but it had given him silence, and sometimes that was enough. Grace sat in the passenger seat, holding Ryan close as the Jeep bumped along the narrow road. "You really live out here?" she asked softly. Ethan gave a short laugh. "Not much living, mostly staying alive." When they reached the cabin, Milo jumped out first, sniffing the perimeter. His movements were disciplined, systematic, checking corners, scenting the air. Grace noticed it, the way the dog moved like an extension of the man beside him. Inside, the cabin was plain but clean, wood stove, single bed, shelves lined with old books and canned food. Ethan cleared space near the window for a makeshift crib and helped her settle Ryan. The baby stirred but didn't wake. Grace glanced around. "You live like someone who doesn't expect company." "I don't," Ethan said simply. She smiled faintly, sitting by the fire he'd built. The flames cast a soft light across her face. For the first time, Ethan saw not the woman who'd been beaten and broken, but someone quietly enduring. She'd been through her own war, one fought in grocery aisles and debt offices instead of desserts. He poured her a mug of coffee and handed it over. "Drink. You need rest." She accepted it with trembling hands. "You sound like someone who's done this before." "Saving people?" he asked. "Running from things," she said quietly. He looked into the fire, the orange light catching the edge of his jaw. "Yeah," he admitted, "a long time ago. Different reasons, same feeling." Silence filled the cabin. Only the crackle of fire and the wind brushing the windows broke it. Milo lay near the door, head resting on his paws, but eyes half open, watching. Grace finally spoke again. "What happened to you, Ethan?" He thought about lying, telling her it didn't matter, but something in her tone made honesty feel less like a risk and more like respect. "I lost men," he said simply. "Good ones. I was supposed to bring them home, and I didn't. When you've seen enough of that, you start wondering if the uniform means anything. So I left." She didn't say she was sorry. She just nodded, as if she understood that grief didn't need consolation, only recognition. By nightfall, the forest outside had gone completely still. The rain started again, light and steady, whispering against the roof. Grace had fallen asleep in the chair beside Ryan's crib. Ethan sat at the table, cleaning the old rifle he kept for hunting, though both he and Milo knew it wasn't animals they were expecting. He'd already placed sensors outside, tripwire alerts he'd used in operations overseas, just in case. The line between peace and war was thinner than people thought. At 11:37 p.m., Milo lifted his head. One ear twitched. Ethan froze. "You hear it too?" he whispered. A faint crunch of gravel echoed beyond the porch. Then another. Slow, deliberate. He stood silently, moving to the window. The fog outside glowed faintly from the moonlight filtering through the trees. Nothing visible, but the pattern of sound was wrong, too precise for an animal. Ethan reached for the rifle, chambering a round without noise. "Stay with her," he told Milo softly, then stepped toward the door. He opened it just enough to see the outline of two figures moving between the trees. One carried a flashlight, its beam slicing through mist. Another whispered something he couldn't hear. Then a metallic click. Suppressor. Ethan dropped low just as the first bullet tore through the window behind him, shattering glass. The shot muffled but deadly. Grace woke with a start. Clutching Ryan, Milo barked once, sharp and commanding, before sprinting to the window, teeth bared. "Down!" Ethan shouted, dragging Grace behind the overturned table. He fired once through the doorway. A grunt echoed from the darkness. Another shot answered, splintering wood inches from his head. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder and rain. Milo lunged through the open doorway, vanishing into the mist. Seconds later came the sound of a struggle, a man shouting, a growl, then silence. Ethan reloaded, peering into the trees. Another shadow moved behind the shed. He exhaled slowly, aimed, and fired. The shape dropped. When the last echo faded, the forest went quiet again. He stepped outside, cautiously. Two bodies lay motionless near the clearing. Milo stood nearby, breathing heavily, one ear torn and bleeding, but eyes fierce. "Good work," Ethan murmured, kneeling to check him. Milo nudged his arm as if to say he was fine. Ethan searched one of the attackers and found a folded photograph. Grace and Ryan, taken in the hospital parking lot earlier that day. On the back, a note in block letters, "Silver Bay, finish it there." He pocketed it and looked back at the cabin, where Grace stood in the doorway, clutching her son and staring at the scene with wide, disbelieving eyes. "They won't stop," she whispered. "No," Ethan said, "but now we know where they're going." He looked toward the dark horizon, where the forest thinned and the ocean began. "Silver Bay," he murmured. "That's where this ends." The dawn came pale and brittle, like glass waiting to break. Mist crawled low through the pines outside Ethan's cabin, carrying the metallic scent of gunpowder left from the night before. He hadn't slept, just sat by the table, rifle across his knees, watching the line where fog met forest. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Grace sat by the hearth, clutching Ryan to her chest. The child slept fitfully, murmuring in his dreams, while the faint glow from the fire painted soft shadows across her face. Her eyes were hollow, but her voice was steady when she finally spoke. "They know where we are, don't they?" Ethan didn't look at her. "They won't come again, not here. Kane's not the kind to waste men twice in the same place." She stared at the floorboards. "Then what will he do?" He paused, the silence heavier than words. "He'll change tactics." The knock came just after sunrise, 3 sharp raps on the cabin door. Grace stiffened. Ethan motioned for her to stay still, then eased the safety off his rifle. Milo was already up, hackles raised, silent but coiled. "Ethan Walker?" a woman's voice called. "It's Sheriff Hayes." Ethan opened the door cautiously. Emma Hayes stood on the porch, raincoat soaked from the drive, her expression a mix of frustration and fear. "You really know how to start a war, don't you?" she said. Ethan let her in. "You got my message." "I got more than that," she replied, tossing a manila folder onto the table. "2 bodies found near the old logging road. Their phones were traced to Kane's private network. Now the state police want to know why my county just turned into a war zone." Ethan flipped open the folder. Inside were photos of Kane's men, a few grainy satellite shots of trucks near the coast, and one name scrawled across the top: Milo Ferris. Emma leaned against the counter. "I know Ferris, ex-private contractor, worked black ops out of Nevada. The kind of guy who keeps score in blood, not money. If he's with Kane, this isn't just about debt collection anymore." Ethan nodded. "He's moving something through Silver Bay. Military-grade cases, coded shipment numbers, probably weapons." Emma frowned. "And your plan?" "End it before he does," Ethan said simply. Grace rose from the chair, holding Ryan tightly. "No," she said, shaking her head. "This isn't your fight, Ethan. You've done enough. You saved us." He turned toward her. His voice was calm, but beneath it burned a conviction she could almost feel. "If I stop now, they'll come again. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not to you, but to someone else who can't fight back. I won't let that happen." Grace's eyes filled, but she didn't argue. She understood now. Not the words, but the kind of man standing before her. Emma handed him a set of keys. "That's a county vehicle, unmarked. If you're really going to Silver Bay, take it. You'll need it more than I do." Ethan gave a curt nod. "Keep them safe." "You don't have to ask," Emma replied. "Just make sure you come back." By mid-afternoon, Silver Bay emerged from the fog like a ghost town. The wind carried the scent of salt and iron, and the crash of waves against the cliffs sounded like distant artillery. The old warehouses stood silent, their windows black and blind. Ethan parked behind an abandoned cannery and stepped out, scanning the horizon. Milo trotted ahead, nose low to the ground, body tense. He followed the dog's lead through the mud and toward the loading docks. The place was quiet, too quiet. Then he saw it, a black SUV near the far end of the pier. The back door was open, and inside, wrapped in a blanket, was Ryan. Ethan's heart stopped. Milo growled, low and steady. From the shadows, a familiar voice called out, "You really should have stayed out of this, Walker." Victor Kane stepped into view, tall, composed, his tailored coat immaculate despite the wind. Behind him stood Ferris, face hard and expressionless, a pistol hanging loosely in one hand. Ethan's eyes flicked between them and the SUV. "Let the child go." Kane smiled. "You know, I almost admire you. Men like you, soldiers, heroes, always chasing redemption. But redemption doesn't pay." "Neither does arrogance," Ethan said, his tone razor-sharp. Kane's smile vanished. "You killed my men, stole from me. You think that makes you righteous? It just makes you next." Ferris raised his weapon. Ethan didn't wait. He dropped to one knee and fired. The shot echoed off the water, sending gulls screaming into the sky. Ferris staggered back. The bullet grazing his shoulder, Milo lunged forward, teeth flashing. Chaos erupted. Bullets tore through crates, splinters flying like shrapnel. Ethan rolled behind a concrete barrier, reloading as waves crashed against the pier. Milo darted through smoke and mist, striking from the blind side. Ferris swung wildly, but the dog's speed was unmatched, a blur of loyalty and fury. Kane retreated toward the SUV, dragging Ryan with him. The baby cried, the sound piercing through the gunfire. Ethan's pulse spiked. That sound cut deeper than any bullet ever could. He moved fast, using the noise of the storm and gunfire to cover his advance. One shot dropped a guard near the SUV. Another hit Ferris in the leg, sending him sprawling. Kane turned, aiming his pistol at the child. "Don't!" Ethan shouted, stepping into view. Kane hesitated, just enough. Milo struck first, slamming into him, knocking the gun from his hand. The weapon clattered into the water. Kane screamed, struggling, but the dog held firm, pinning him to the ground. Ethan closed the distance, rifle raised but steady. Kane froze, breathing hard, the weight of his empire collapsing in that single moment. "You can't stop what's coming," Kane hissed. "There's more than me out there." "Then I'll find them too," Ethan said, and slammed the butt of his rifle into Kane's jaw, ending the fight. He dropped to his knees beside the SUV and lifted Ryan carefully from the back seat. The baby whimpered once, then went quiet against his chest. For a brief moment, Ethan just held him, a small, fragile life trembling in the hands of a man who'd once forgotten what life meant. Milo limped toward him, muzzle streaked with blood that wasn't his own. Ethan reached out, resting a hand on the dog's neck. "Good boy," he whispered. "We're done." When the sirens came, they were distant but growing. Sheriff Hayes and her deputies closing in. Ethan stood at the edge of the pier, the wind whipping against his face, the child warm and alive in his arms. He watched as Kane's men were cuffed, Ferris dragged away bleeding, but alive. Emma approached, her boots echoing on the wet boards. "You're lucky to be standing," she said quietly. Ethan looked at her, eyes tired but certain. Luck had nothing to do with it. She followed his gaze to the child in his arms and smiled faintly. "You did good, Walker. Maybe even more than good." Ethan didn't reply. He just looked out at the horizon, where the storm clouds were breaking, letting in a thin band of sunlight over the gray water. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. Not the false kind found in silence, but the real kind earned through battle and sacrifice. Behind him, Milo sat watching the sea, ears pricked, as if waiting for orders that would never come. Ethan turned toward the cabin road in the distance and whispered, "Let's go home." The storm had passed, leaving the Oregon sky bruised, but clearing. The sea lay calm, its surface gleaming like glass under the newborn sun. The smell of rain still lingered, mingling with salt and smoke from the burnt wreckage near the docks. For the first time in weeks, the air no longer tasted like fear. Ethan Walker sat on the edge of the pier, elbows resting on his knees, watching the slow roll of waves below. His hands were wrapped, a thin line of gauze still showing above his wrist. Beside him, Milo lay stretched out, chin on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. A soldier's rest, never deep enough to forget. The child's cries had faded to soft coos inside the sheriff's cruiser, parked by the loading bay. Grace Miller sat there, her head against the window, eyes red but calm. Sheriff Emma Hayes was on the phone a few feet away, coordinating the final sweep. Federal agents had arrived at dawn to take Kane and Ferris into custody. The handcuffed men sat in the back of another vehicle, faces gray and silent. When Emma ended the call, she walked over, her coat whipping in the wind. "You look like hell," she said. Ethan managed a tired smile. "I've looked worse. They're taking Kane to Portland. Ferris, too. You won't have to worry about them again." He nodded, but didn't seem comforted. "There's always another Kane somewhere." She studied him for a moment. "Maybe, but not in my county." Behind them, Grace stepped out of the car, holding Ryan against her shoulder. The baby stirred, then settled, his small hand clutching the edge of her shirt. She approached slowly, hesitant, as though afraid the quiet would shatter if she moved too fast. "Is it really over?" she asked. "For now," Ethan said. "You'll be safe. Hayes will make sure of that." Grace looked at the ocean, the sunlight breaking in long streaks across the surface. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to." "I do," she insisted. "You could have walked away. Most people would have." He didn't answer. There wasn't a word big enough to explain why he hadn't. Milo stood, shaking off seawater, and pressed against his leg. Ethan ran a hand through the dog's fur. "He's the one who found the kid first," he said quietly. "Instinct's better than mine." Grace smiled faintly. "He's loyal." "More than most." For a long while, none of them spoke. The wind lifted the edges of their clothes, carrying away the last traces of gunpowder and salt. Somewhere behind them, an agent barked an order, and the sound of car doors slamming echoed across the bay. The law would take it from here. That part of the fight was over. Emma came up beside him again. So what now? Ethan looked toward the distant tree line, where the road back to Silver Creek disappeared into fog. "I'll head out for a while. There's always work for men who don't mind quiet." "You could stay," she offered. "The town owes you." He shook his head. "You don't build peace by staying where you bled." Emma sighed, understanding. "You ever get tired of running?" He looked at her with the faintest trace of humor. "Not yet." A few days later, Silver Creek began to look like itself again. The newspapers ran the story. Local Lone King exposed in weapons smuggling ring. Most of the town didn't read beyond the headline. People liked their peace simple, their heroes unnamed. Grace reopened the store. The shelves still leaned from the scuffle weeks before, but she restocked them one by one. Sometimes she caught herself listening for the rumble of a jeep or the sound of a dog outside the door. Most days, it never came, but every now and then, a stranger would stop by, leave a few extra dollars on the counter, and ask about the Navy man who saved a mother and child. She'd just smile and say, "He moved on." In the evenings, when the sun sank behind the pines, Grace would sit by the window with Ryan asleep in her arms. She'd watch the road disappear into the forest and whisper a prayer, not of thanks, but of hope, that wherever Ethan Walker went, the world would be a little kinder for having him in it. Far from town, the cabin still stood. The bullet holes in the window had been patched, the porch cleaned, the smell of firewood replaced the stench of battle. Ethan sat on the steps, cleaning his knife in silence while Milo dozed beside him. The radio inside played faint country static, a reminder of life beyond the trees. He'd turned it low. Too many voices reminded him of command briefings, of orders, of loss. Out here, the silence spoke enough. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded photograph he'd taken from one of Kane's men, the same photo of Grace and her son. He looked at it for a long time, then tore it in half and let the wind take it. "Job's done," he murmured. Milo lifted his head, ears flicking. Ethan smiled. "Yeah, I know. You're still on duty?" The dog gave a soft huff, then laid his head back down. When the sun dipped below the trees, Ethan stood, slung his pack over his shoulder, and started down the path that led away from the cabin. He didn't know where it went, maybe north, maybe nowhere, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running from something. He was walking toward it. Behind him, the cabin faded into shadow. Ahead, the world opened wide and waiting. Milo trotted beside him, silent and steady, a heartbeat in the forest's quiet rhythm. Together, they followed the road as dawn touched the horizon, painting it gold. Ethan glanced at the light breaking through the trees and whispered, almost to himself, "Let's see who needs saving next." Sometimes miracles don't come with wings or light. They wear muddy boots and carry scars from battles we'll never see. Ethan Walker didn't ask for a second chance, yet God gave him one the moment he chose to protect a mother and her child instead of walking away. That's how grace often works, quietly, through ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Maybe that's the message hidden in this story, that faith isn't about waiting for miracles to arrive from heaven, but about becoming one for someone else. In a world full of storms, even a single act of courage can be the prayer that saves another soul. So tonight, as you close this story, take a moment to thank God for the unseen protectors in your life, the quiet heroes who stand between darkness and light. And if this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to believe in hope again. Leave a comment, subscribe to our channel, and help us spread these stories of faith, courage, and redemption. May God bless you, keep you safe, and guide you to be a light for others, because miracles don't end in stories. They begin with hearts like yours. Type Amen in the comments. If you believe God still sends His angels among us, sometimes they just happen to wear a SEAL uniform and walk beside a loyal dog.